Hello, everyone around the world. Welcome. Bienvenidos, que quiero irte, to Coloring My Way Across the Globe. I'm your host, Lauren Battistini, color consultant, artist, language learner, and world traveler. Join me each week as I chronicle the most colorful people, places, and experiences I encounter off the beaten path, both near and far. So, let's go. Vámonos, que pame. Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. Today's guest is Carmen Sognonvi of Top Flight Family. Carmen is a world traveler, a content creator, and an entrepreneur raising kids with her husband Serge in New York City. Welcome to the podcast, Carmen.
Thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to share the story of how we met because I think it's so appropriate for the topic today.
Most definitely. In fact, that was going to be my lead-in question. Tell everyone how we met, please.
Okay, so Lauren met our family at a little ramen bar in Tokyo. I think it was maybe the last night of our trip. We'd spent 3 weeks in Japan. We'd gone through 3 different cities. I think, Lauren, you hit more than us. And we were just got to chatting at this ramen bar and really hit it off and kept in touch. And here I am on her podcast.
Well, as soon as I met you and your family, well, first off, it started with I just feel like I just struck up a conversation with you and Serge, and I was commenting on how precious your daughters are, and they've just got this beautiful curly hair, and I've got curly hair too. And so, realizing you all were Americans, I started asking you some questions about, well, what are you doing in Japan? And then the subject came up of, oh, well, we're here as a family, but we're travel influencers, and we work in that kind of travel space. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more in depth and tell us about your work and what you do with Top Flight Family.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you so eloquently described, essentially, I create travel content, and so I've been doing this since 2016. And my family and I essentially travel the world, and we share our travels through social media, videos. We're on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And our particular niche is luxury family travel. That's kind of most of what we've focused on. And so we really like to show families that I think sometimes when people think about traveling with kids, it's the sense of drudgery. People don't usually think luxury. They think oh, it's going to be awful and difficult. And we really try to show people that, you can actually do this in comfort and style. And obviously not every trip you're going to be bawling out. Like we certainly don't on every single trip. But there are, even on those trips where, you are on a little bit more of a budget, there are ways to really bring in, just those elements of comfort and style that just make the trip that much more enjoyable.
Well, after we met, of course, I immediately followed you on Instagram and I began looking at the type of content that you produce. And what I've really enjoyed is that it's so authentic and it's not so sales driven and sponsorship driven. It's not to say that you don't work with brands. You absolutely do work with brands. And I recently listened in on one of the webinars that you did, which was for people who are interested in becoming travel influencers. And one of the things that you said is that you've learned in your line of work that to be successful, you really need to provide good, rich, genuine content that's informative, educational for people. And when you sprinkle in some of these more sponsored posts, that's fine. But you've become very strategic in the way in which you do these collaborations and partnerships so that you're not inundating your audience with paid ads or sponsored content.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of content creators or influencers struggle with this, right? How can you sort of stay authentic while still working with brands and doing sponsored content? And my philosophy as a creator has always been transparency is key. I
Yep.
think that especially in this year, we're recording this in 2024. So audiences are really savvy nowadays. And I think, the sort of old school way of being an influencer is to pretend that everything is organic. Like, oh, we just happen to be at this luxury
Yep.
hotel. Oh,
Right.
we just happen to be taking this first class flight. Oh, I just happen to be unboxing this Chanel bag. And it's like you lose the trust with the audience when you pretend that all of this is just happening. Or even the idea that oh, I just happen to turn on the camera. I just love making content just for the sake of it. And it's
Right.
people know that this is a very lucrative career now. They understand that there's a business motive and there's no need to hide from that. Like certainly you don't have to lay out your like 5-year business plan to your audience. Like that's not really appropriate
Right.
or, necessary. But there's no need to pretend that there's no business behind what you do, that there's no, you know, profit, that there's no revenue model behind it. And I've always been very sort of open with my audience about like, hey, anytime we're being hosted by a hotel or a tourism board, I come right out and say it. I don't try to hide it. And what I've actually found is that your followers respect you more when
Yep.
you are open about these things, and they actually trust you more because the creators that never disclose anything, their audiences kind of end up assuming that everything is sponsored, even
That's
things that are
right.
not sponsored.
Yeah.
So it kind of has the opposite effect. So I just think like in this time, day and age, you can't just condescend to your audience. Like you have to understand your audience is very savvy, and you need to treat them as the intelligent, media
Hmm.
consumers that they are.
Yes, and two things I'll tell you. Before I met you, my concept of travel influencer was the person there in Santorini, and I've been to Santorini, Greece, who's up there with the blue dome, taking a picture in a long flowy dress, lining up with all the other influencers to do that, and everything seems so perfectly polished and staged. But in the research that I've done prior to launching this podcast, what I'm noticing is that our audiences, be it audio or visual audience, they want authenticity. They want long form video. They don't want everything to be so polished and so edited. They want real educational content from an actual human being to whom they can relate. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how you define luxury travel. And well, first I'll share with you, for me, in some ways, I consider myself to be a luxury traveler, but it's not for me about high dollar necessarily. To me, luxury travel looks like what I did last year. I spent five weeks in Greece, and it was October when it was at the tail end of the tourist season, and I had all the space I needed to do whatever I wanted to do. So what felt luxurious to me was being, for example, on the island of Aegina, at this little spot at the water where only the locals go. It was by this lighthouse, and only the locals go there during the siesta hour to swim. So I basically had all the water to myself with maybe 3 locals. That felt like luxury travel to me. However, that same day I was renting a little bitty stick shift car driving up and down the mountains of Egina, freaking myself out. Was that really luxurious? I don't know. It was kind of frightening. So how do you define luxury travel, and how does your audience define it?
Yeah, so I love that you shared that. And actually, what you described about swimming by yourself does tie into my definition of luxury travel. So,
Okay.
the way that I define it, or at least this is our family's approach to luxury travel, is I'm all about saving time, reducing hassle, and maximizing comfort. And I think what you described about swimming in this beautiful spot where only locals are, you're not swarmed by tourists, you're maximizing comfort right there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
that's right.
it may not be, you're staying in a 5-star luxury hotel, but that experience of having a beautiful place to yourself without having to fight the crowds for it, that is luxurious in some ways. And so, yeah, to me, again, it's about saving time, reducing hassle, and maximizing comfort. So, obviously, when it comes to the type of travel we do, absolutely we do the things that you would normally associate with luxury travel,
Oh,
like
yeah.
business class flights and fancy hotels and resorts. Like certainly we do those things, like
Yes.
high end fine dining. But to me, luxury is also um, actually a great example is in Las Vegas. The Bacchanal buffet, that's like very legendary. A lot of people don't realize that you can pay a little bit extra. I think at the time we went, it was like an extra $20, and you get to skip the whole line. You just walk straight in.
That feels like luxury to me. That really,
That's luxury because you're saving time, right?
yeah.
And is $20 like such a inordinate amount of money? No, like certainly you could save that and spend it on other things. But if you really want to, prioritize that buffet and you don't want to like waste your whole day standing in a
Yeah.
line, why not? So I love like paying to skip a line. That's one of
I,
my
I,
favorite things.
it's well, especially traveling with children, I would also want to
Yeah.
do the same. So it sounds like you define luxury as really being experiential, and that can involve an extra cost or
Mhm.
not. It just
Yeah.
depends. So that's good. I just was curious about your insights, because the way that I see your platform, though it's luxury travel, you're not at all stuffy. You're not at
Right.
all pretentious or stuffy. You just want to have some beautiful experiences with your family. And yes, stay at some exclusive resorts and have that first class or business class flight experience. I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. So I
And
want,
I have been known to do a flying dress photo shoot now and then too. So
and
guilty as charged.
and hey, listen, who could blame you? Who doesn't want to take a picture in some exotic place in a long, flowy dress? We only live
It
once.
was pretty fun, I'm not gonna lie.
I can't say I blame you. And hey, listen, had I had a dress on that particular occasion when I was in Santorini, I really might have done the same had I also had someone to take a photograph of me. I'm not saying I wouldn't. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to shift gears for a moment to talk about a little bit about what I do and how it compares to this travel influencer world. So I identify you obviously as a travel influencer. I consider myself, by way of this podcast, as well as the travel illustration I do with my art, I consider myself to be kind of a travel slash cultural conversationalist. So what feedback do you have about that, and how do you see the differences?
Yeah, no, I love that because, well, first of all, I love the term conversationalist because it's obviously pertains to this podcast. This is literally a conversation, but it's also interesting if you look at the variety of podcasts out there. I think there are some that are very much about teaching. There are some that are very much about journalism and sort of hard hitting interviews. And then there are some where it's like, it's really about the art of conversation. And I think the people that are really good at that, like that is a special talent that is so worthwhile because, you know, as a listener, you just kind of like get swept along and it's like you're eavesdropping on like two really interesting people like sitting at the next
Mhm.
table, right? Um, yeah, I think it's, you know, what you do and what we do, there are certainly some overlaps because
Mhm.
ultimately, you know, content and creating content or creating media for an audience, I think that's sort of like the common factor.
Yes.
So the business models may be different kind of on the back end of like, you know, where the revenue comes from and what is being sold, but yeah, I think there's certainly overlap.
There is overlap, and I think that the differentiator for me with this podcast especially is that not only is this a travel based type conversation, all my guests reveal great travel tips, places they've traveled around the world, but it's also a cultural type of conversation. And I delve into language learning, culture, food, sometimes music. So it's partially travel space based, but it's covering a lot of other topics as well. Topics I find to be colorful, which is hence the name Coloring My Way Across the Globe.
Yeah.
So I always invite guests onto the show who, to me, are very colorful themselves and have a lot of insights about off the beaten path experiences. And so that's one of the main reasons I've invited you to be my guest. And again, I'm so happy to have you here. So I want to talk about, with all the travel that you've done, if you can tell us one or two places around the world you've been that you thought would just be kind of average travel experiences, but turned out to far exceed your expectations.
Yeah, I think that I have two different ones that I can share. One is domestic, and then one is a little further flung. And one of the destinations that we've recently fallen in love with is Destin, Florida.
You're
And I
right.
think when
Okay.
people think of Florida, you know, I think there are, you know, the Florida man stereotype exists, right? For a reason. And I think there's a lot of stereotypes that people have with Florida, or they just think Disney, which, you know,
Right. It's so much
we
more
love
than it.
Disney. We go there a lot as well. But Destin, if you haven't been, is, you know, on the panhandle part, I guess,
Yep.
of Florida.
I used to go there summers as a child because
Well, right,
I
because
was born
you
I
grew up
was
in the
born
South. Yeah.
yeah, I was born and raised in New Orleans, and that would
Yes.
be a summer vacation spot for us. But it's been decades since I've been, so I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, and you know, I live in New York, so I think among people in the Northeast, that part of Florida is not as like popular of a destination versus like, you know, we tend to go to like Miami and, you know, Orlando, you know, here in the Northeast. But I was taken aback by just the absolute beauty of the water and the beaches. And we've been to some of the world's best beaches. You know, we've been to the Maldives, you know, we've been to a lot of Caribbean islands. But I
Hmm.
have to say that the water and the sand in Destin rivals some of the best beaches in the world that we've been.
It does. It absolutely does. I'm glad to hear that. So it
Yeah.
surprised you in that way. What's your second location that surprised you?
So the second location, I would say is okay. We're gonna venture into a little bit more touchy territory here.
That's fine. Do
Um, so actually, where we met you, Japan. So
yes.
obviously, my family had always wanted to go to Japan, especially Sean, my oldest daughter. Tokyo was definitely like high on her list.
Hmm.
And the thing about me is that I'm Chinese. So my mom's Hong Kong Chinese, my dad's Belgian. And, China and Japan have had a very unhappy history. We were colonized by Japan. There were a lot of wartime atrocities. A lot of Chinese families were personally impacted by World War II, and my family was no exception. And so I think a lot of Chinese people have grown up with this sort of very negative view of Japan, Japanese
Hmm.
culture. Like it's a weird dichotomy because on the one hand, like we worship the pop culture. Like even, nowadays, obviously anime, all this stuff is huge. But even when I was a kid, like in the 80s, Hello Kitty, all these
Yes.
things were like really, really big. So on the
Right.
one hand, they're sort of like we relish the pop culture, but then we're like, ugh, I don't know about the people, I don't know about that country. And so, if I'm going to be totally honest, I went into that trip with some trepidation, and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to feel,
Yeah.
going there.
Understandably.
Yeah, and it really blew me away. Like certainly all those things in history did happen, but it's wild to go to a place and just have it be completely different from what you were sort of taught to think of a place. And I think that's why travel is so important, right? Because we grow up with all of these preconceived notions that were either taught to us or that we picked up along the way.
Yeah.
And it isn't until you actually go to a place that you really see it for what it is.
I really agree with you. And I'm happy that I'm blessed that you were open enough to share this because I think that it makes perfect sense for you to go into that trip with some preconceived, understandable notions and sort of a little bit of I'd say, pain in your heart about your people's past
Yeah.
and that tenuous relationship between two countries. And so, first of all, kudos to you for setting that aside so that you could have this rich travel experience. I'll tell you that my son and I, when we met you, we were also on the tail end of our trip to Japan. We had gone to many locations and within Japan, and that trip also exceeded my expectations. I had no idea what to expect, and I just found that the culture, the I think sense of beauty and structure and order and the way that the Japanese pay attention to every single little detail and everything is presented and packaged so beautifully. Now, I'm very loud because A, I'm from New Orleans, born and raised. I am part Spaniard, Italian, a little French and Scottish mixed in. We are a loud people. So, and my son and I together were loud. We're very boisterous. So I had to give him a little, he and I had to give each other a little bit of a tutorial kind of before we got to Japan because we're so loud. So we really, over those 2 weeks, had to completely tone it down. So to be respectful of the culture, obviously we do not look Japanese. Our hair and everything. There were people staring at us and kind of laughing about our hair because it's all afro. I have an afro basically. It's pulled back today, but we learned a lot on this trip, honestly, about Japanese culture, and it just so surprised us, and it was such a beautiful experience. So we didn't know what to expect either when we went.
Yeah.
So it was really nice. So a couple of questions for you about language learning. You are really multilingual, multi-ethnic, and I'd say multicultural, and not just because you're in New York City. Tell me about you speak four languages. So tell me about
Ah.
oh, well, stay with it. I'm like, I speak three languages, but my Greek is really rough.
Yeah.
So tell us about your family history, your ethnicity, and then how and why you've learned these languages.
Yeah, so I would say English is definitely the only language that I'm absolutely fluent in. I'm not going to claim fluency in any other language, and
Fair
the
enough.
rest of them are all like various shades of bad. But yeah, just to give my background, so I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong we speak Cantonese. And so that's sort of the dialect. So I grew up, my second language. Well, technically, I probably learned Cantonese before I learned English. So I grew up speaking Cantonese, but I'd never learned to read and write. So because I went to like international schools, British schools, and so I can understand and I can speak, but even the speaking is not like 100% fluent.
Right.
Definitely proficient, I would say. And then we lived in Shanghai for a few years when I was a kid. So that's in mainland China. And there, they have their own dialect, also Shanghainese, which actually as a kid I could understand. I couldn't speak it, but I could understand it fluently.
Excuse me, did you
Not
just say
anymore.
Shanghainese?
Yes, yeah, Shanghainese.
Because in my mind, I would think Mandarin, but again, different dialects in different parts of the
Oh,
country. Yes.
yeah. So
Fun.
Mandarin is sort of like the official Chinese language that's
Okay.
like spoken everywhere. But then each place will have like its regional dialect. So yeah, so I also learned Mandarin because that's mostly what we would speak to communicate in
Mm.
Shanghai. But again, like the written language for Chinese is the same across the board. But again, didn't really know how to read and write. And then we also lived. My dad's Belgian, so we also lived in Belgium for a couple of years when I was a kid. And he's from the Flemish side of Belgium. So
Hmm.
Belgium is split into Flanders and Walloon. And so in Walloon, on the Walloon side, they speak French. On the Flemish side, they speak Flemish, which is basically the same as Dutch. It's the same language, just kind of a different accent.
You are listening to Coloring My Way Across the Globe. Stories of the most colorful people, places, and experiences off the beaten path, both near and far. As hosted by myself, Lauren Battistini. Each week, I'll be interviewing color professionals, artists, world travelers, language learning experts, digital nomads, other entrepreneurs, creative professionals, visionaries. There's something here for everyone interested in the world around them. Keep listening, there's more to follow.
And so, yeah, actually moved to Belgium. I think I was like 6 years old, and I didn't speak a word. And went to a local school, and like within a few months, I was like fluent and amazingly like head of the class.
Wait, fluent in Flemish or fluent in French?
In Flemish.
In Flemish.
Yeah.
My goodness, you've been exposed so far. Hold on, so far. English, Cantonese, Shanghainese,
Yeah, yeah,
sort
I
of,
can understand a little bit.
little
Mandarin.
Mandarin, then Flemish, and some French.
Yeah, and then I learned French basically in high school.
That's a lot going
But
on.
they're all like quite bad nowadays, so I don't want to overstate it.
Though, just today on Instagram, I saw a reel or a video or something that states that's just truly statistically, those of us who are multilingual, okay,
Mhm.
that we have superior or better problem solving skills
Mm,
than monolinguists. And
interesting.
that makes a lot of sense to me because you've got six languages floating around in your head at any given moment. And so you have to stay on your toes, truly, truly.
Yeah.
So you and I had a conversation before this interview in which you said, I'd really like to share my kind of take on, it's an unorthodox take on language learning. Tell us what your tips are or your opinions are on language learning.
Yeah, so I think the reason that my take is a little bit different is a lot of people who love travel also end up loving learning languages. Like those things kind of go hand in
They
hand. And
do.
certainly, in my world of like travel content creators, travel influencers, a lot of travel creators are multilingual. And it's something that they have pursued as adults, not even like they grew up, speaking
Oh,
multiple
yeah.
languages. It's something they learned as adults. I don't really fall into that category because I have to say that for me, learning new languages was always something that was imposed upon me because it was my family dragging me to live in this country, dragging me to live in that continent, and like having no sense of stability and having to like
Yeah.
start over every time. And I, was a very shy and introverted child. I'm still a huge introvert, which, people are often surprised by that, but I am. And so to me, like learning languages doesn't doesn't have a very positive association in my life,
But
and so it's not. It's. I often think about it like I really need to learn Spanish. Like I feel like I know all of these languages, and Chinese is obviously useful when I go back, but like for travel, like a lot of the places we travel to, like Spanish would be the most practical, and it's like
yeah.
one of the ones that I just don't know any.
But
So I'm often like I should really learn that, and then I'm like, I don't have that. To me, language learning is not happy, and
how
like I just have some like honestly some pain and trauma
well,
associated with it.
I was just about to say here that for you, you were uprooted, and God bless your parents, right? Our parents do the best for us that they can, but a lot of times for business reasons, families will relocate.
Mhm.
But for a young adult or a young child, you've already established friends in this new country. You learn the language, you have some connections, and all of a sudden your family's uprooting you to a whole new place, whole new culture, whole new language. You have to make new friends. that is a very jarring experience. So of course, as an adult, you're going to associate that. Anytime you're trying to learn a new language present day, you'll associate it with those past experiences. So in those moments though, as an adult that you're having to learn some new language, what tips can you give those of us who are in the process of learning languages? How should we go about doing it?
So I wouldn't say that I've really learned a whole new language as an adult, so I don't really have any tips regarding that.
Okay.
But one thing that we definitely do before every trip is, you know, I think people often um, are intimidated about traveling to places that maybe, you know, it's not primarily English speaking, or they feel like, oh, are people going to treat me differently because I don't speak the local language? And what I've always found, like even in places like France, which is notorious for frowning upon people's bad French skills,
Yeah.
I found that like people mainly like want to see that you're at least giving it a try. You know, and like you don't have to like show up like trying to like blab out a whole paragraph, but like literally every place we go to, and you know, there were a couple years where we were doing like back to back to back trips, so it's not like we had tons of time to learn languages in between,
Right.
but we would literally just like find a TikTok video that just went over the main words like hello, thank you, please, you know, bathroom, goodbye,
Mm.
you know, just like 4 or 5 stock phrases.
Yes.
And if you just say those, then, you know, people just appreciate it. Even if the rest of the time you're speaking English, but you follow it up with like what thank you in
Yes.
whatever that language is, it's
Yep.
appreciated because then immediately you don't come off as this arrogant, like presumptuous person where it's like, oh, why don't you speak English? And you
Mhm.
know, a lot of people don't mean to give off that vibe, but I think, you know, just adding that, like those little phrases, sprinkling them in, makes all the difference.
Well, in this regard, you and I have the exact same philosophy because every time I travel to a new country, while I'm on the plane to that country, I'm actually writing out several phrases. And my cardinal rule of traveling to a new country is to at least learn how to say hello, good morning, good afternoon, please, thank you. But most importantly, do you speak English?
Yes, that's a good
But
one.
hold on, I asked them in their native tongue if they speak
Love
English
it.
because I do not want to be, and let's face it, the stereotypical US American loudmouth tourist who thinks that you have to speak English. And in fact, so as to not even give off that perception, a lot of times I'll ask them in their language, do you speak Spanish
Mm.
or do you speak English? I a lot of times lead in with Spanish only because we have such a bad reputation as US Americans. I don't want to admit that I speak English. I know that might be over the top, but I just get a little bit nervous about that when I travel. So I like to at least, like last year, I was in Portugal for a week and a half, the Czech Republic for a week. I was in Greece for 5 weeks and Japan. And so and I'm learning Greek as my third language. So for those who don't know, I speak Spanish as my second language and learned it through a full immersion program in Costa Rica decades ago, and then have begun studying Greek as a third language. That's a hard language. But every place I go, I at least want to seem like a polite, gracious tourist. So I like that you all take the time to learn some phrases before you travel. That's a good thing.
Yeah, although let me just jump in and just say one also maybe little bit unorthodox thing about the speaking English when abroad thing.
Please.
I absolutely agree with everything you said. I think the more that you can not assume that everyone, you know, like not demand that everyone speaks English to you, that goes a long way.
Right.
But I think that one thing Americans sometimes, and this is not, you know, particularly you, but just, you know, other American travelers I've talked to often forget is that English is the common international language.
It really is. Sure.
And so even if you're traveling through Europe and there are people from different European countries gathering in another European country, very often those people are speaking English to
That's
each
right.
other. And so it's not, I don't think it's inherently like, I don't know, colonizing behavior to like speak English when you're traveling, because actually you'll find that people from lots of other countries where English is not the primary language are also going to be primarily speaking English when they
What
travel. So
that is correct.
I also feel like we don't have to be like so self-conscious of that,
That's
but
correct.
certainly be aware of the sort of ugly American stereotype and like
Sure.
don't fall into that. But you know, English is truly, it is a universal language
And
nowadays.
don't we say it's? I mean, it's don't we say lingua franca? Is that the word? It's the lingua franca. There's an
I think
expression.
so, yeah.
It's something like that. Lingua franca. It's the language it's the international language, so to
Yeah.
speak. So Okay, I want to talk to you about a couple of other things as we sort of wrap up here. One is, what does it look like to you to live a colorful life, and how do you live colorfully? Sort of two-part question.
Yeah, I think to me, living a colorful life is really about challenging yourself to get uncomfortable. So, even though we do luxury family travel, however, we've certainly, done a bit of roughing it here and there as well. We are very much city folks, like born and bred, right? Like I've never not lived in an apartment, basically. But so we're very indoorsy by nature. But even despite that, like we as a family have kind of challenged ourselves to like get uncomfortable and do things like skiing and like snowboarding. Well, actually, we haven't done too much snowboarding, but we've done like snowmobiling, doing things in the cold, which we're not super used to, even though, because New York City, it doesn't get that cold.
Yeah, right.
Like surfing, like, all of these kinds of like, fairly adventurous things that, put you in touch with nature. That isn't like my, that doesn't come very naturally, I would say, to us as a family.
Hmm.
But we've really challenged ourselves to kind of like have these experiences. And then there's a lot of things that we've really enjoyed and have done them again. And then there's some things where we're like, okay, well, we tried it. We don't have to do it again. It wasn't for us, but I'm glad we tried it. So I think for me, it's very much about like breaking out of like, we all have our little comfort zone, whatever that is, and like, occasionally breaking out of it.
I love that, and that to me does sound like a colorful life. And you and Serge, as parents, are instilling this type of life in your children. So I do want to talk about that for a moment. When I see families traveling and they're traveling with their little babies, for example, and they've got the backpacks and the diaper bags and the car seats, these moms and dads look miserable, Carmen. Their kids are crying. They're trying to change poopy diapers on a train. They are not happy, in my opinion. I could be wrong. This is just me as an observer. You, as a luxury family travel expert, when do you feel, or at least when for your family, was an ideal window of time to travel with your kids so that you're not flustered and they are old enough to understand and experience it for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's honestly going to be different for every family.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
our case, we didn't really start traveling with our girls until our youngest was 3.5. But that wasn't necessarily because we didn't want to. We were just busy running our business. So we just didn't have time to get away.
Yeah.
I know a lot of families that start very young with, infants. We didn't, but again, it doesn't mean that I'm against doing that.
Hmm.
Certainly, there are more logistical hassles the
Yeah.
younger your children are, right? But I think that's something that often gets missed in the conversation about traveling with kids is I think people often focus on like the sort of educational benefits from, being exposed to different cultures and learning languages and, seeing different types of geography. And certainly those are absolutely benefits of traveling with kids.
Yeah.
But I actually think that the biggest benefit of traveling with kids is the life skills that they develop along the way. Like my girls, we kind of over the pandemic for about 3.5 years, we homeschooled our girls so that, we could kind of travel very extensively. Before that, they were always in public school. And this year, they actually went back to school in person. One
Okay.
started middle school, one started high school. So huge jump. They pretty much went from elementary, essentially skipped middle school because that's what we were doing, homeschooling. And then one got plunged right into high school, one got plunged right into middle school.
Mm,
And they have handled the transition flawlessly. And
I
that's
believe
not to say
that.
like it wasn't, there weren't challenges. Of course, there were, but it's because through travel, the skills that they have picked up on of adaptability, flexibility, staying calm under stress, being able to adapt to changing conditions, knowing that one thing that we planned didn't actually work out and being okay with shifting gears. Like all of these really, really important life skills are things that kids bring with them throughout their life. And I think that is actually, to me, in my opinion, even the more valuable aspect of what kids actually learn from traveling. And so that aspect, the younger you start, I think the better. Because you
Very good
hear a
point.
lot of families talking about like, oh, I have a toddler and I could never bring him to a restaurant because he'll be a terror. But it's like, well, how is he ever going to learn to behave in a restaurant if you never bring him to a restaurant. And it's kind of the same with travel. Like if you
Yeah.
do start traveling with babies and toddlers, guess what? They're going to be, by the time they're 4, they're going to be champs. They're going to roll with the punches. They know how, how to like fall asleep in weird places at odd
Yes.
times. They know how to like eat things that are, not mac and cheese, like
Yeah.
all of these skills that kids learn. And I think that part sometimes gets lost in the conversation about like family travel.
I agree with you, and that's a very good, fresh, and insightful perspective. And frankly, let's be honest, those families that I see where they look miserable, well, of course they're going to look miserable in that moment. They're on a train trying to change a poopy diaper with a screaming kid. However, I'm not seeing them for the remaining 2 weeks of their travel where they might be meeting extended family and it's a family reunion and everybody's happy because they're helping out with the babies too.
Yeah.
So let me not judge. I am not judging. It was just an observation, but I do love your
Hey,
insight.
I judge too. It's okay to judge.
Well, I micro-judged. I sort of micro-judged a situation. My bad. I really want to, as we close here, and I want to give you a platform to discuss your business, Top Flight Family, and what you're doing in 2024, not just to reach your existing audience to give them information, but your mentorship that you're also doing within the travel space. Tell us all about it. You have the floor.
Thank you. Well, in addition to actually making travel content myself, over since like 2020, I've been really passionate about also mentoring the next generation of up and coming travel content creators. No gatekeeping here. I'm not like trying to keep all the opportunities for myself. I think there's so much opportunity in this profession and this industry, and also like there's still such a lack of diversity when it comes to travel content. And not just racial diversity, but like diversity of perspectives, ages, body types. Like I love seeing sort of like non-traditional people, sort of not the typical what you think of as an Instagram influencer of like the hot blonde in the white bikini with the like tan scaled body. Like certainly, hey, love their content too, like no shade, but I think there's always going to be room for that, but I think people also want to see like people who reflect their lives traveling and
Yeah,
what that
absolutely.
looks like. And so yeah, so for the last few years I've been sharing tons of free tips on my Instagram. Every Monday I do like a Q&A where I answer people's questions about how do I get into this field, how do I build an audience, how do I make travel content. And then actually, very recently, I launched my own podcast. It's called Small Steps, Big Moves. And it is all about the intersection of business and influence. And so we talk about influencer stuff, content creation, but we also talk about entrepreneurship and marketing because obviously, when you're a content creator, you also become an entrepreneur and a small business owner.
Oh,
And
yeah.
those lessons are pretty universal, right? Like, regardless of like what industry you're in. So yeah, those are some of the resources. And also, for folks who want to sort of delve into this and learn more, you can actually go to travelinfluencerclass.com. And it's basically just a free training I have that kind of gives you an overview of how to get started in this. And then I do also have a paid course. I'm Miss Transparency here. I'm not going to like stick it on you.
Let me
So in that free class, I also talk about that. And if that's something you want to, dive even deeper into, that's a great way to work with me.
Well, I personally want to ask you about the paid course. You didn't ask me to, but I do feel like when my guests have a business, I always like to shed light on it. And this is your livelihood. It's okay to discuss those paid offerings. So please do tell me more about the paid course. I really do want to know.
Yeah, well, first, Lauren, thank you for giving me permission to
Yeah.
talk about this, which obviously we pre-cleared in our previous conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, my paid course is called Unlock the World, and it basically walks you through step by step. How does it work when you're a travel content creator to like, how do you work with hotels and tourism boards to get, quote unquote, free travel? And of course, like free travel isn't really free, right? It's really a value exchange. So it's like,
Yeah.
the partner is getting something out of it, you as the creator are getting something out of it. You kind of work together to create mutually beneficial content, marketing, etc. So yeah, that course basically walks you through exactly how to sort of package yourself as a creator, what brands are looking for, how do you pitch brands, how do you negotiate those deals, which kinds of trips are paid, which kinds of trips, they're just going to like put you up, but they're not actually going to pay you cash. What's the difference between those kinds of projects? Basically demystifying a lot of the stuff that a lot of people wonder, like, how does this work? And so basically you get to sort of like peek behind the curtain and really learn how to actually do this yourself.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful course. Is this something, how long is the course?
Oh, so it's completely self-paced. So you can join anytime. It's an online video course, and there are basically 5 modules. And it's up to you how long you take to go through it. Some people like to binge it in a whole weekend, and then
Yeah.
some people like to do one lesson a week. Just depends on your learning style.
And lastly, do you offer any type of mentorship, one-on-one mentorship for those travel influencers who have already done your paid course and are really wanting to take it to a heightened level?
I do. That's actually something we're going to be rolling out soon for students who are already in Unlock the World. So I don't have anything live like right this second, but it's
Yeah.
actually something that I'm working on. So I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
to,
like
to me,
literally I've been working on that for like the last week.
well, yeah, and to me, that's just the natural next progression because no matter how awesome your course is, which I'm sure it is, you would recognize that each travel influencer is going to have some unique niche within the market and therefore will need some more customized advice as they take their business to the next level. So I'll frankly tell you, I've been very inspired by the content I've seen. You do deliver a lot of just complimentary content, not only through the webinar, but on your Instagram. Because again, here in my world, what I'm doing right now is I'm sorting out ways in which I can converge my worlds of color specification, of art and travel illustration, and then this podcast. So
Hmm.
the whole coloring my way across the globe concept, I'm always looking at ways in which I can fit that into some type of monetized business model. And
Yeah,
it's always a work in progress and I'm sorting out things as I go, but listening to you speak about your travel influencer world has helped me because some of what I do skims that world. Again, I don't consider myself
absolutely.
to be a travel influencer, but I'd say I'm a, again, cultural and travel conversationalist. I want to educate and inspire and encourage people to have their own colorful experiences. So what you do is a piece of that, for
Absolutely. And
sure.
I think, combining color with travel makes so much sense. Like I've personally really gotten into like fragrances recently, fragrances and candles. And obviously that very much ties into the like luxury hotel experience, right? As soon as you walk in, it's like one of the things that immediately hits you is like how the place smells, and it
Hmm.
instantly, takes you a certain place. And of course, color plays a huge part of that experience, that experiential thing as well.
Yes.
So
So,
yeah,
so in my art world, this is what I've been focusing on a lot lately. You see behind here, I've been doing a lot with florals. Let me tell you something. Florals are a great play on color. They tap into
yeah,
my expertise of both color and art. And from a commercial artist perspective, I absolutely could see myself pitching my florals to a beauty or a fragrance brand or maybe a hotel chain to
hmm,
where my colorful florals can be incorporated somehow either into packaging or an ad campaign. So I'm
yeah.
constantly thinking about, again, how to intersect those worlds of color, art, and that travel culture influence space. So, well, Carmen,
You're
it
onto
is
something.
I think so. Well, this has been such an amazing conversation, and I always want my guests to walk away feeling as though, and you said it in the beginning of this episode, they're in on just an interesting kind of cultural conversation, and that's what we've done today. So I feel in my heart that we've educated and inspired somebody out there somehow. So
I hope so. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was so fun to catch up, and like what a perfect way to come full circle of like how we met almost, I guess, almost exactly a year ago, I think.
it has
Yeah.
been because we were there in the end of May, so it's been
Yeah.
just shy of a year. So, well, I want to thank you for giving so freely and graciously of your time. I know you've got a busy schedule, and really for the insights. I was blown away by what you had to say, and you were transparent about it with the language learning. And so, that's one thing I think you are known for within your travel influencer space. You're known for your excellent content, your generosity in giving that content, but also your groundedness and your transparency. And that absolutely is what draws me to keep going back and looking at your content. So kudos to you. You're doing a really great job.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I appreciate you, Carmen, and everybody else. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And until next week, stay colorful. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Coloring My Way Across the Globe. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation, and we would love to stay connected with you throughout the week. The best way to connect is by subscribing to our newsletter at www.lfbcolor.com. That's www.l as in Lauren, F as in Frank, B as in boy, color, COLOR.com. Also, you may find us on Instagram using the same handle, LFBcolor, for the latest stories, podcast guest profiles, travel photography, language learning diaries, and my own colorful art. Hope to see you there, friends. Thank you again.